When my HOA declared war on my harmless garden gnome collection, I thought it was just another petty rule dispute. But I had no idea those little statues would spark a battle that turned my quiet street into the most entertaining drama of the year. The day my gnomes became public enemy number one. I always thought my neighborhood was one of those places where people waved from their porches, borrowed cups of sugar, and argued about football teams, not lawn ornaments. Our street was quiet, lined with tidy yards, pastel-colored mailboxes, and the occasional wind chime tinkling in the breeze. People kept to themselves, more or less, and for years that suited me just fine. Then came the gnomes. It started innocently enough, like most obsessions do, with just one. I spotted him at a flea market on a Saturday morning, buried between crates of old vinyl records and chipped teacups. His paint was faded, his hat a little cracked, but there was something about his goofy grin that tugged at me. $5 later, I carried him home and placed him right beside the bird bath. I named him Horace. Horace looked so at ease among the marigolds that I felt compelled to get him some company. 2 weeks later, I stumbled across another gnome at a garage sale, this one holding a fishing rod, a little plastic trout dangling from the line. His face was a touch more mischievous, the kind of smirk you'd expect from someone who cheats at cards. I called him Gus. Horace and Gus made quite the pair. By the time spring turned into summer, I had 6 gnomes scattered across the front yard, one snoozing in a hammock, one pushing a wheelbarrow, another playing a tiny banjo. Neighbors would chuckle as they walked their dogs, kids would stop and point, and even the mailman admitted they made his route a little brighter. To me, it was harmless fun, a splash of whimsy in a world that often felt too stiff and serious. Apparently, my HOA didn't agree. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, folded neatly into an envelope stamped with the HOA's official logo, a pine tree with roots stretching down like claws. At first, I thought it was just another notice about recycling bins or lawn mowing schedules, but when I opened it, bold black words stared up at me. "You are in violation of community standards." I read the line 3 times, blinking, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something friendlier. The letter went on to explain that excessive and non-conforming lawn ornaments were strictly prohibited under Section 14, Subdivision 3B of the HOA guidelines. My gnome collection, it declared, was unsightly, disruptive, and not in harmony with the community's aesthetic standards. In other words, my gnomes had become outlaws. At first, I laughed. Surely this was a joke. Unsightly? Disruptive? These were gnomes we were talking about. Cheerful, squat little figures with rosy cheeks and red hats. How could they possibly threaten the fabric of the neighborhood? But when I flipped the page, the tone grew sharper. If I didn't remove the gnomes within 10 days, I'd face escalating fines. Fines for gnomes. That night, I stood on my porch, arms crossed, staring at Horace, Gus, and the rest of their ceramic family. They seemed blissfully unaware of their newfound criminal status. The hammock gnome continued to snooze, the banjo player looked mid-song, and Gus still dangled his trout with eternal satisfaction. My yard wasn't cluttered. It wasn't messy. It was cheerful. But to the HOA, cheer apparently counted as contraband. The next morning, I caught my neighbor Linda watering her roses across the street. Linda was one of those folks who seemed to know everything about everyone, without ever being told. I wandered over, letter in hand. "Linda," I said, waving the paper, "did you get one of these?" She adjusted her sun hat, peering at the notice. Her eyebrows shot up. "Oh dear, garden gnomes? You've really stirred the pot now." "Stirred the pot? They're statues, not fireworks." "You don't know the HOA like I do," she said with a sigh. "They've been cracking down lately. Last month, they told Tom and Sarah their porch swing was too squeaky. Too squeaky? Can you imagine?" I shook my head, half amused, half bewildered. If a squeaky porch swing could ruffle feathers, then I supposed my little army of gnomes didn't stand a chance. But still, the idea that they were somehow ruining the community felt ridiculous. That weekend, I decided to test the waters. Instead of removing my gnomes, I added one more, a baker gnome holding a tray of ceramic muffins. I placed him proudly by the mailbox, as if he were greeting passers-by with fresh pastries. It was a silent protest, a cheeky little statement. I wasn't going to be bullied by a rule book. The reaction came swiftly. By Monday, another letter arrived, this one thicker, angrier. The HOA was disappointed by my lack of cooperation and warned me that fines would begin at $100 per week, doubling if I continued my flagrant disregard for community standards. I'll admit, my stomach twisted as I read it. $100 wasn't pocket change, and the thought of it doubling each week made me nervous. But when I glanced out the window and saw a pair of kids giggling as they pointed at the baker gnome, the worry softened. Those smiles were worth more than $100. And so, the battle began. HOA rules, petty power plays, and my secret plan to fight back. By the time the second letter arrived, I knew the HOA wasn't bluffing. They were coming for my gnomes with the kind of determination usually reserved for wildfires or sinkholes. To them, my yard wasn't a patch of grass dotted with cheerful figurines. It was a battlefield, and I was the enemy. The letter was sharper this time, as if the very paper carried an edge. They had underlined phrases like gross violation, non-compliance, and escalating financial penalty. I could almost hear the voice of Harold Jeffries, the HOA president, dictating each word in his smug, nasal drawl. Harold was the kind of man who ironed his socks, a stickler for order in a world that didn't always provide it. He was also the type who loved the sound of his own authority. I still remember the first time I met him. It was years ago at a neighborhood barbecue, where he spent most of the afternoon walking around with a clipboard, taking notes on how evenly people had trimmed their hedges. When someone offered him a burger, he said, "Too greasy," and instead lectured the host about patio furniture that wasn't architecturally consistent. Harold wasn't just on the HOA board. He was the HOA board in spirit, if not in title. So when I read those letters, I heard Harold's voice behind them, and my blood pressure rose accordingly. At first, I thought maybe I'd take the quiet route, write a polite letter back, maybe request a meeting, see if compromise was possible. But the more I mulled it over, the angrier I became. These gnomes weren't hurting anyone. They weren't offensive, they weren't dangerous, and they sure as heck weren't disruptive. If anything, they were community art. That Friday, the HOA scheduled a compliance meeting in the community clubhouse, a squat brick building near the tennis courts that always smelled faintly of chlorine. I decided to attend, figuring I'd plead my case in person. Maybe reason would prevail. When I walked in, I saw the whole board lined up behind a folding table like a jury. There was Harold in the center, of course, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. To his left sat Marlene, the treasurer, a woman who treated numbers with more affection than she treated people. On his right was Frank, the secretary, who never spoke without consulting the HOA handbook first. A few other members dotted the row, all looking equally grim. I took a seat across from them. The room was mostly empty, except for a few curious neighbors who had come to watch the spectacle. Linda gave me a supportive thumbs up from the back row. Harold cleared his throat. "We are here today to address your repeated and willful violation of community standards regarding lawn ornamentation." "Good evening to you too, Harold," I said, trying to inject a little levity. "This is no laughing matter," he replied, his lips pressed into a thin line. Section 14, Subdivision 3B clearly states that residents may display no more than 2 decorative lawn ornaments visible from the street. You currently have... He glanced at his clipboard. 7. 8, I corrected. I added a baker last week. A ripple of chuckles ran through the audience. Harold's face darkened. 8, he repeated, as if I'd confessed to arson. This is a blatant disregard of the rules we all agreed to when moving into this community. Blatant disregard? I leaned forward. "They're gnomes, Harold, little statues with fishing poles and banjos. They make kids laugh. They make people smile. Tell me, who exactly are they hurting?" "The rules are the rules," Frank piped up, flipping through his handbook as though it contained divine scripture. "If we make an exception for you, then what's next? Flamingos, yard dinosaurs, entire nativity scenes in July?" "Sounds fun to me," I said. Another burst of laughter. Harold slammed his palm on the table. "This is not a comedy show. This is about maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood." I looked around at the people seated in the back row. Most of them looked bored, some amused, but none seemed particularly scandalized by my gnomes. It struck me then that this wasn't about community standards at all. This was about control. Harold leaned forward, his voice lowering to a grave tone. "If you do not comply within 7 days, fines will begin, and if those fines are not paid, further action will be taken." I raised an eyebrow. "Further action? Like what? You gonna send a gnome SWAT team to my lawn?" Even Linda had to stifle a laugh at that one, but Harold didn't flinch. His eyes burned with a kind of quiet satisfaction, the look of a man who thought he had me cornered. I left that meeting with 2 realizations. 1, Harold was never going to back down. 2, neither was I. When I got home, I stood in my yard, surveying my little army of ceramic comrades. Horace looked ready for battle, Gus still dangled his trout proudly, and the baker by the mailbox looked like he was offering muffins as bribes. They weren't just decorations anymore, they were symbols. Removing them would feel like surrender. That's when the idea struck me. If Harold and the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But I wouldn't fight with angry letters or fines. I'd fight with creativity, with stubbornness, and yes, with gnomes. I was going to turn my yard into the most spectacular, unforgettable gnome display the neighborhood had ever seen, and I had just the plan to make it happen. How my gnomes got the last laugh, and the HOA learned a lesson. By the time summer reached its peak, my yard had become less of a lawn and more of a legend. What started as 8 gnomes soon multiplied into dozens. Every week I added a new one, sometimes 2 if I found good deals at flea markets or thrift shops. There was the pirate gnome with a chipped sword, the yoga gnome balancing precariously on one leg, even a wizard gnome with a crooked staff. My front yard looked like a carnival of whimsy, and people noticed. Neighbors who once walked by with polite nods now slowed down, taking photos with their phones. Kids dragged their parents to see the Gnome Village, as they called it. Even the mailman began timing his deliveries to give himself a few extra minutes to admire the growing collection. But not everyone was charmed. The HOA letters escalated into threats, each one harsher than the last. They promised fines, liens, and even legal action. Harold, of course, was the loudest voice behind the crusade. He marched up to my house one afternoon, clipboard in hand, his face the color of a boiled beet. "You think this is funny?" he barked, pointing at the wizard gnome. "You're making a mockery of this neighborhood." I smiled. "Not a mockery, Harold. An attraction. Look around." And he did. Right then, 2 teenagers stopped on their bikes to snap a picture. Across the street, Linda waved proudly as if she were my campaign manager. Harold sputtered, his authority crumbling beneath the undeniable truth. People liked the gnomes. But Harold wasn't one to admit defeat. At the next HOA meeting, he rallied his board members with fiery speeches about standards and discipline. They voted to take me to court if I didn't comply. That should have scared me. Instead, it gave me fuel. I decided to go big. Over the next 2 weeks, I transformed my entire front lawn into a sprawling, themed gnome display. I built little wooden bridges across the flower beds, set up ceramic mushrooms for seating, and even installed a tiny pond with gnomes fishing from its edge. At night, I strung fairy lights through the hedges, casting a magical glow that made the scene look like something out of a storybook. It wasn't just a collection anymore. It was art, and people came from blocks away to see it. Cars slowed down in the evenings, families strolled by after dinner, and one neighbor even brought her elderly father, who laughed so hard at the sight of the yoga gnome that he nearly fell over. Word spread on social media, too. Someone posted a photo with the caption, "The Great Gnome Rebellion, worth the walk." Within days, my yard was a minor internet sensation. Local bloggers showed up. A reporter from the small-town newspaper called to ask for an interview. The HOA wanted silence, but what they got instead was publicity. The turning point came during what Harold dramatically dubbed the emergency hearing on lawn compliance. The clubhouse was packed, every seat taken. Neighbors who never cared about HOA meetings before were suddenly eager to witness the showdown. Some wore homemade shirts with slogans like, "Let the gnomes stay," and "Small statues, big freedom." Harold pounded the gavel as if he were presiding over a criminal trial. "This resident has defied repeated orders, flaunted community rules, and caused disruption with his so-called art installation," he thundered. I stood up slowly, clutching a folder. "If I may present Exhibit A." The room leaned forward as I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of printed photographs, not of gnomes, but of other violations around the neighborhood. Fences painted colors not in the guidelines. Cars parked in driveways overnight. Satellite dishes mounted without approval. Each one technically a breach of HOA standards. "If we're talking about selective enforcement, Harold," I said, letting the photos fan out across the table, "then maybe we should apply the rules evenly. Because as far as I can tell, this community is full of violations, but somehow, the only one you're obsessed with is me." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even Marlene, the treasurer, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Harold's jaw tightened. This is irrelevant." "It's very relevant," I shot back. "You can single me out just because you don't like smiling ceramic faces on my lawn. That's not governance, Harold. That's bullying." The audience burst into applause. Some even stood up, cheering. I could see Harold shrinking behind his clipboard, his power slipping like sand through his fingers. That night, the board voted to review the case further instead of moving ahead with fines, which in HOA language was as close as I was going to get to victory. But the story didn't end there. The local news picked up the tale of the Gnome showdown, framing it as a battle between creativity and conformity. A short segment aired on TV showing me standing proudly among my gnomes while Harold refused to give a comment. The clip went mildly viral online. Suddenly, I wasn't just a homeowner with quirky lawn decor, I was a symbol of neighborhood resistance. The best part? The attention worked in my favor. The HOA board, now under the scrutiny of public opinion, began backing off. Fining me would make them look ridiculous. Suing me would make them look petty. And Harold, once so smug, now avoided eye contact whenever he saw me on the street. By autumn, the war was effectively over. My gnomes remained, my yard was thriving, and the HOA had slunk back into silence. One crisp evening, I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee, watching the fairy lights twinkle over my little gnome village. Kids skipped by, pointing out their favorites. Neighbors waved, and in the middle of it all, Horace, the very first gnome I'd bought, stood proudly beside the bird bath, grinning like he'd known all along that victory was inevitable. I leaned back, a smile spreading across my face. The HOA had threatened, bullied, and blustered, but in the end, the gnomes got the last laugh. And honestly, I wouldn't have had it any other way.